Senator Rubio, it's great to have you here. Let's start our conversation with what you are working on presently as a Republican alternative to the DREAM Act. First of all, what is your timetable? What are the fundamental principles of that legislation, and what are the details within it?
Well, let me start by saying that the best public policy always originates from a real-life example or a real-life story. And that, for me, dates back to my time in the Florida legislature. We had a concept called Idea Raisers, which led to a book called 100 Innovative Ideas for Florida's Future. And what we did is we literally traveled the state, asked people what they would do if they were in our position, and then actually came up with public policy because of that. Now, throughout my campaign, even in the midst of a Republican primary, I said very clearly that while I couldn't support the DREAM Act as it was currently constructed, I felt we had to figure out a way to accommodate young people who found themselves in that unfortunate circumstance. About 3 months ago, maybe less, we had the example in Miami, Florida, of a young lady named Daniela Pelaez. Daniela was brought to this country at a very young age, I believe when she was 4, from Colombia. Her mom entered legally, but the visa expired when her mom returned to Colombia. But Daniela's been raised here her whole life. Daniela grew up in our public schools, did everything that her teachers asked of her, did everything their community asked of her, did everything her family asked of her. And this year, in a few weeks, she'll graduate as the valedictorian of her high school with a 6.8 GPA. She'll be admitted to Dartmouth, and she wants to be a molecular biologist in a country that says they need more scientists. She also has a deportation order. So I looked at that and said, well, if she was 6'7" and could shoot a jump shot, we're going to keep her. But if she's a molecular biologist in the future and a valedictorian, we're going to deport her. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So what can we do to address people in her circumstance? And the idea is to basically take the way some of the concepts of our existing immigration programs and apply them to that case. So the general concept is that she would receive, or kids in her circumstance, no criminal record, graduate from American high school, etc., would receive the equivalent of a non-immigrant visa, basically, which we award to people all over the world to come here and work. And that non-immigrant visa legalizes you. It allows you to stay in this country and go to school or study, not forever, unless you renew it, but it's a non-immigrant visa. It doesn't allow you to become a resident or a citizen. However, it also doesn't prohibit you to try to become a resident and ultimately a citizen. You just have to do it the same way as anyone else with a non-immigrant visa would have to do it. So it doesn't create a special pathway to citizenship, but it doesn't prohibit access to the existing pathway to citizenship. So at the end of the day, by and large, people in her situation will be no better off and no worse off than anybody else in the world who gets a non-immigrant visa. She will be legally able to drive and go to school, and if she desires to become a citizen, first a resident, then a citizen, she would have to do it the same way as any non-immigrant visa holder in the country would get, or anyone in the world would get to do it, which that is applied through the normal process. That could take some time, but the good news...
How much time?
Well, it depends. The existing non-immigrant visa, the existing residency process takes time, depending on how you're accessing it. Are you doing it through marriage? Is a family member claiming you, or are you coming on a work visa? It all depends on which route. And some of them have quotas and time limits, etc. So she'd have to go through that process, and anybody who got there before she would be ahead of her, or people like her. But she would be legally able to work and go to school while she's waiting. So that's the general concept. Obviously, we're curious we want to make sure that there's not any unintended consequences, either negative or positive, either in her case or the nation's case. So we're working through it.
What are the potential negative consequences you're afraid of?
Yeah, first of all, there's real-life applications. We're already dealing with some of them, in terms of, well, what is the age limits? How old can they be? How young can they be? If they're going to school, you're not going to let them have financial aid. You're not going to let them have in-state tuition. Will they be allowed to work while they go to school? These are the questions that we're working through to try to find solutions for. Here's the good news. We're involving the dreamers. We're involving the kids themselves. In essence, I very much appreciate input from immigration groups and members of Congress and the media and others, but the people we're trying to help are the ones whose opinion we're most interested in addition to those who know how the laws work. And we're working with them, and so to make sure that the bill's properly crafted from their perspective. We also want to make sure that we don't do anything that either rewards illegal immigration or encourages it in the future. So I'm confident we'll get a common sense plan that I hope will be bipartisan. There are plenty of other things we could fight about, but I think this one is good for our country if we could confront it and solve it in a positive way. And so I aspire to do that, and we'll see what the outcome is.
When do you intend to introduce it?
Well, when it's ready. And it'll take a little bit longer. It won't be next week, but it won't.
Will it be this summer?
I hope so. What I'm cognizant of is that there are a bunch of kids like Daniela that want to go to school this fall. So on the other hand, I'm also already trying to see the reality that it's an election year. And sadly, there are plenty of people who would rather this issue not be solved this year because they'd rather use it as a political tool in the 2012 elections. Just very recently, after years of hearing from some of my Democratic colleagues, not all, there are many who legitimately want this issue to be solved, but there are a handful whose job is, to message politics. And after years of hearing about how important it is to solve this issue, and they want the Republicans to reach out and see if we can find some common ground, well, here I am. And all of a sudden, it's been dismissed offhand as unacceptable. And I've seen things reported about it that are not accurate. I've heard terms used like permanent underclass. None of these things are true. So I think what I'm suspecting here, and you guys have been here longer than me, so maybe you know better than I do, what I'm suspecting here is that some people had really counted on this issue to use it as a wedge in this election. And the thought of it somehow being solved before November is terrifying to them. And, but we're not going to let that stop our work.
Well, but politics plays both ways. There might be some who would say, well, you're coming to this issue late in an election year because Republicans have a sizable perceived disadvantage on this issue, something you've talked about.
Yeah, I don't think one bill is going to change whatever that disadvantage may or may not be. One of the big mistakes we make, and I think we're going to talk more about that today, but one of the big mistakes we make in terms of talking about how can we make the Republican view on limited government conservatism a viable political theory and ideology in the minds of a growing number of Americans, including those of Hispanic descent and African Americans. One of the mistakes we make is we view it through the lens of the next election. And I think this has to be a longer-term commitment than that. I mean, I think this is not something we can't, this is not just what can we do over the next 3 months to win an election? That's not the design of this bill. And it can't be because it doesn't work that way. I think the real thing we need to start thinking about is this is what we offer. This is our argument as to why free enterprise, the American free enterprise system, is the best economic system in the world for people who are trying to make it, for people who are trying to create a better life for themselves and to leave their children better off than themselves. This is why we argue that the American free enterprise system with a limited government involvement is the best system in the world for that. And that's got to be kind of a long-term commitment to make that argument, not just an election-by-election commitment to make that argument.
You mentioned the terminology permanent underclass. There are those who have said your concept, as you've sketched it out, basically would force someone who's grown up here, culturated here, assimilated here, successful here, to live for years and years and years in a non-status sort of limbo, which some do think is a permanent underclass, that yes, you're allowed to stay here, but you don't get any of the fruits of the things that you most aspire to. Well, why isn't that a fair criticism?
Because it's not accurate. There is no limbo. The limbo is what they have now. They would have a non-immigrant visa, which would legalize them in this country, would allow them to get a driver's license and go to work and pay taxes. But
they couldn't vote?
Well, you have to become a resident and then a citizen. But there's a process for doing that. Okay. And millions of people around the world have followed that process when they come here. And thousands of people are waiting to follow that process now. And they would have every opportunity to follow that process as well. They wouldn't have any special access to that process. The one benefit they would have is that they would be able to remain studying and working in the United States while they're waiting for their turn to come up in that process. And obviously that process is more complicated, more expensive, and more burdensome than it should be. But that's not a function of this bill. That's a function of a broken legal immigration system, which is a whole other topic that we probably should discuss at some point here in this country as well.
All right, on the other side of the idea that you sketched out, Chris Kobach, who you well know, immigration advisor to Mitt Romney's campaign, has said this: I'd absolutely reject any proposal that would give a path to legal status for illegal aliens en masse. That is what amnesty is. I do not expect Governor Romney to propose or embrace amnesty. Your reaction?
Well, the bill, once again, all it does, it takes something that already exists, which is non-immigrant visas, and applies it to children who have grown up in this country, who spent thousands of dollars educating, who, in the case of Daniela, want to be a molecular biologist in a country that's looking for more molecular biologists. Allows them to continue to contribute to this country, and if they eventually decide that they would like to become residents and then thereafter citizens, allow them to do that the same way that anybody else in the world would be able to do it, and that is by accessing the existing route that is now in place. That's what this bill does, and that's my concept. That's the concept we're working on, and I don't think that falls, within that criticism or some of the others that I've heard on either side of the debate.
Do you think Governor Romney would be likely to support a bill like yours?
I would hope so. I think it's important. He's now the leader of the Republican Party. And so I would hope that we could convince him to support a concept like this. But first, in fairness to him, we have to have it. I mean, concepts are great. You got to have an actual proposal so that he can understand it. And we're not there yet. We're trying to get there. We're
Are
working
you in
hard
any
to get there.
conversations with the governor or staff as you develop this?
I haven't. I think members of my office may have alerted them to the fact that we're working on something like this because they're going to be asked about it in the press. But, and my understanding is that he said that he's open-minded and would wait until we have a proposal to make a decision about where he stands on it. So we're working towards that. I'm hopeful, and I think it's important that we can come up with something he can support. But I think also something that would unite our country. I think there's polling out this very morning that shows that, in fact, the proposal, the concepts that we're working on, share broad bipartisan support, broad ethnic and social economic support, and I think it'd be a unifying thing. You know, the saddest thing about immigration is that it was not so long ago a very strong source of pride for our nation. It's something we bragged about. We're a nation of immigrants. Now, over the last decade, it's become a source of division in our country, partially a function of a really out of control illegal immigration problem. And
Who's responsible for that division?
Well, the illegal immigration problem is the genesis of it. Look, the United States can't be the only country in the world that doesn't have immigration laws. I mean, I think we've been pretty generous with legal immigration. And I think we have to remind ourselves that there are millions of people in this country whose parents or themselves came here legally. That there are hundreds of thousands of people all over the world that are standing in line and waiting to enter this country the right way. We see them in our office all the time. You know, their moms, their brothers, their husbands are in line somewhere, and they've paid the fees, they've waited. If you've ever gone to a citizenship ceremony, where especially these big ones where like 1,000 people becoming citizens, I guess the closest thing I could describe it to is like the birth of a child or a wedding. I mean, it's that level of celebration and happiness. Let's not forget that every year, thousands of people become citizens of the United States who waited and did it the right way, and we should recognize that and not overlook that. That the vast majority of Hispanics in this country entered legally or their parents entered legally. So we always should remind ourselves of that. Now, the U.S. cannot be the only country that doesn't have immigration laws. Our immigration laws are much more generous than Mexico's, with all due respect. And if you don't believe me, ask the folks in Guatemala. So, but we also have to recognize that there are things that are wrong with our current legal immigration system. It is not a modern 21st century legal immigration system that does not take into account the realities of the demands of our 21st century economy. And I do think a modernization of our legal immigration system would help diminish some of this conflict that we have in our society.
I asked a question about division because there are some Latinos in Arizona or in Alabama who would say the laws passed in those two states are divisive, have divided people, have hurt commerce, and have given people of Latino descent a sense of fear about their very existence in this country.
Well, anytime you have a runaway problem, that leads to not just immigration problems, because certainly the porous border with Mexico has impacted a state like Arizona, for example, in a way that it hasn't impacted the state of Florida. So Arizona, California, and Texas, but specifically Arizona, has a very unique circumstance there where it's not just, workers coming over the border. I mean, you have guns, you have drugs, you have human trafficking, you have a humanitarian crisis in that desert between Arizona and Mexico. And the people of Tucson and Phoenix are feeling that firsthand. And so when you have this runaway crisis and an unresponsive federal government, it is going to lead to public policy reactions at the state level and otherwise. And that's
Which
what
you
we're
support.
seeing.
Do you support the existing Arizona
Well,
law?
let me say this about that, because I think that's also been misreported. I understand why the people in Arizona did what they did. And I think that if you live in a state like Arizona that was facing and is facing the challenges that Arizona faces, people would understand why they reacted the way they did. I believe that Arizona and states like Arizona have a constitutional right to do what they did. I do not believe that laws like Arizona should be a model for the country. In essence, I don't believe Florida should have an Arizona law. I don't advocate that other states have an Arizona law. I would much rather the federal government deal with the illegal immigration issue and modernize our legal immigration system. Because if we could do that, it would avoid the need or the emergence of laws like the one you saw in Arizona.
What about the Alabama law? What are your thoughts about that and how that state is struggling both from a commerce perspective, available workers, and people having to leave the places that they had chosen to live because they can't comply or they fear that they might be ensnared?
And once again, it's the same as what we talked about with Arizona. I'm not nearly as familiar with the unique aspects of Alabama and the unique challenges that they faced in that state in comparison to what I know a little bit more about, which is the public safety aspects of the border with Mexico. But I think that law has had some counter impacts that this has led people in Arizona to rethink the approach that they've taken. I know that agriculture in Arizona is concerned about the impact that it's having on their business. I think what we're going to learn from state-specific responses to immigration is that at the end of the day, they're going to lead us back to the conclusion I reached long ago when I was in the state legislature and was faced with attempts to pass Florida-specific immigration laws. And that is that these are issues that are better handled at the federal level, because immigration is a federal issue. And it's one of the fundamental issues that our country, that our federal government needs to confront and solve.
Can the Republican Party survive this election and have a nominee that doesn't have a sketched out and clearly identifiable and understood position on the DREAM Act and immigration itself?
Yeah, look, immigration is a gateway issue, because while I tell people, so all across the country tonight as Hispanics sit down for dinner, by and large, the discussion's not going to be dominated by the DREAM Act and immigration policy. Now, if your mom has a deportation order, if someone you love is facing uncertainty and limbo, if your next door neighbor is going through this sort of upheaval and division of a family, it certainly weighs on you. But that's a gateway issue, because how you feel about that issue sends a message in some communities about how you feel about them. But the fundamental issue in the Hispanic community is the economy. It's this burning desire to leave my children better off than myself, that I am going to work as hard as I can and do everything I can, not just to be better off myself, but to make sure that my kids can do all the things that I couldn't do. That all the things I wanted to be when I was a child but wasn't able to do, I want my kids to have a chance to do that. And the real competition moving forward in America and in our political debate is going to be which party, which political ideology, which view of government's role in our society best addresses that desire. Is it free enterprise? Is it a greater government involvement? And I think we have a very strong argument to make. I do. I believe that big government hurts the people that are trying to make it. I do, because let me say, if you have complicated regulations and complicated taxes, the guys who are trying to make it, the gals who are trying to make it, they can't comply with that stuff. They can't afford to hire the lawyers, the accountants, the lobbyists to change the law. The corporations can, the big companies can, but the little guy can't. So big companies and big corporations and the people who have made it, they may not like big government, but they can afford to deal with it. It's the people who are trying to make it. It's the employee who thinks they would do a better job than their boss and wants to go out and open up their own business, who can't do it if the regulations and the tax code are so onerous and complicated that they can't comply with it. You see that every single day, and entrepreneurship is a burning desire as well in minority communities across this country. I think we have a very compelling argument to make, but you can't do it in a 30-second commercial or a 60-second soundbite. It's going to require a long-term, consistent, committed commitment to focus on this issue of economic empowerment and drive that point home with real-life examples of the difference between a government dominance of the economy or a government overindulgence in the economy and a free enterprise system where government plays a role, an important role, but not a dominant one. And that's really a decade-long effort or more, not a quickie.
For the broad topic of Next America, let me ask you a question about your party and the way our country is changing. Mm-hmm. In the Republican primaries this year, except for the outcomes in Nevada and Arizona, the voter turnout was 90% white or higher in every state. And 60% of the voters in every state were above 50 or older. So it tends to be, look at your party, the Republican Party, is more white and more old at the levels of its voter activism, participating in your primaries. Yet the country around it is changing. Hispanic growth is not just limited in where I grew up in San Diego, California, or Arizona. It's all over the country. And the voters who seem least pleased in survey after survey after survey, ours and others, who are least comfortable with that, tend to be the voters at the base of your party. How great do you feel the tensions within your party about who shows up, who votes, who's activist, who tries to get your ear, and yet the changing demographics of this country, and how do you match those, and how big a struggle do you think that is for you and for the party?
Well, how I view it is this way. I view it as, I'm sitting here saying, okay, here's a community where the vast majority of people are dying to do better than their parents did and are really dying to leave their kids better off than themselves. That's what free enterprise is all about.
But they're not in your party right now.
Exactly. And so you have to ask yourself, well, hold on a second. We have the solution to this problem. We have the ideal solution to their desires. What we believe in should be speaking directly to their hopes and their aspirations. Why aren't we connecting? Why isn't that? That's what we should be concerned about. How come this demographic group in America that would be the biggest beneficiaries of what we believe in our opinion anyways, how come they're not responding to our message? And that's what we need to be asking ourselves. And then, of course, the answer is going to be, well, you need to, elect more people of a certain profile, or you need to run more ads in Spanish. Well, that's not, obviously, those are tactics. But I think what has to happen is a permanent commitment that we are going to take the time and the energy in the long term to make this argument about why limited government and free enterprise is the right answer to their desires, to their aspirations. So I am concerned because there's this growing demographic in America who I think at a minimum we should be competitive in, and we're not. And there's a reason for that. We've got to find out what that reason is, but more importantly, we have to commit to telling our story consistently and more effectively and over a period of time, not just on one issue or one election.
Does that mean you'll be telling the story as Mitt Romney's running mate?
No, that's a very, first you hypnotize me, then you ask me. No, you know, look, look, I'm flattered by all of that, but the truth is we have a plethora of very talented Republicans, of people who have served for long periods of time at different branches of government. And there's so many really highly talented people out there who I think would do a great job. And
are you saying you're too inexperienced to be vice president?
What I'm saying is, well, look, the bottom two things on that. Certainly, I'll be more experienced next year than I am this year, but I think that's true for all of us. I'm not new to politics. I served 9 years in the Florida legislature. I've been here a year and a half, had a pretty high-profile campaign. I'm older than I look. I know I'll be 41 this year, but I feel 42. But no, that's not the point. The bigger point is that we've got a lot of really talented people and out there that Mitt Romney's going to get to pick from. And I think a lot of them, you know, Senator Rob Portman, would be phenomenal choices for vice president. And that's where I would encourage them to look at, because I'm enjoying my service in the Senate.
If asked, will you say no?
Yeah, I don't want to be the vice president right now. And
if Mitt Romney asks, you will say no?
Yes. But, you know, he's not going to ask. That doesn't work. He's watching this interview, so he'll know. Look, the bottom line is I really want to do a good job in the Senate. I mean, I think the Senate is a very valid place to shape and drive American policy. Foreign policy, which I enjoy deeply. The issues we're talking about now. If I were running for vice president, I would have to answer questions about my dog.
Maybe so, but
since both candidates are answering questions about dogs these days.
So let me role play this for just a second, because you gave a very lengthy answer that Mitt Romney might find not only persuasive, but
no product placement in this one?
No.
All right.
Something he may really respond to, and he may say to you, Senator Rubio, look, I saw your answer about how we connect and what our problem is with the Latino community in our country. You're the solution. I need you to run with me. Our party needs you to run with me. You're still going to look him in the eye and say no. You're still going to say no.
And this guy,
you will still say no. Even
I'll travel anywhere in the country and deliver that message as this junior senator from Florida.
But you'll say no.
Yeah, look, my answer hasn't changed, and I really think that in the United States Senate I can have an impact. And I hope, here's the truth, okay, I hope that we have a greater sense of urgency in the Senate. I was asked yesterday on the train, you know, what's the first year been like? And I really like the people I serve with in the Senate. There's an old joke that when you first get there, you look around and say, my goodness, how did I get here? Look at so-and-so, he's so famous, and so-and-so, he's so famous. And after about 6 months, you look around the room and say, how did they get here, you know? But I haven't had that sense. I really like the people I served with on both sides of the aisle. I've made some really good relationships with individual senators. It's a lot of fun the times we can work together on some issues. But I really am concerned about the lack of urgency in our country on some of the issues we face, because I'm so the 21st century should be more the American century than the 20th was. Everything is going our way around the world, everything, in terms of what we want the world to look like in the 21st century. This can be every bit the American century, not just in America. This time it could be the American century all over the world. And we have an opportunity to help shape that if we only had a little sense of urgency about being America again. In essence, we have a few things that we have to solve. If we get those things solved, by the time my children are my age, they will live in a world so prosperous and so peaceful, not totally peaceful or totally prosperous, that I can't even describe it to me. We have a chance, for example, in Africa, to eradicate AIDS. I mean, that's an amazing accomplishment, the eradication of AIDS that American generosity has contributed towards. 20 years ago, we didn't even have a way to treat it. And now we're ready to eradicate it on a continent, largely due to American leadership, with both President Obama and President Bush have played a role in. I'm going to have a chance to contribute to that as a United States Senator. I'm excited about that prospect. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years from now, if I do a good job as Vice President, I'm sorry.
You guys all got that, right?
As a senator?
You all got that, right?
If I do a good job as a senator instead of a vice president, I'll have a chance to do all sorts of things, including commissioner of the NFL, which is where the real power is, you know.
I'm going to use some moderator discretion here. I know we're a little bit over time, but you are our absolute special guest. I want to let the audience ask a question or two if you'd like. Yes, Mr. Ray. Right here. Right here. Right here, yeah.
Good morning. Frank Fuentes, National Alliance for Hispanic Families. There are 61 million Hispanics in this country, the vast majority of whom do not have an immigration problem. Their concerns are the well-being of their children, their education, health care, etc. Okay. How do we change the discussion, the conversation, the dialogue, away from immigration, which is holding hostage the real attention that these human service, social service needs of the Hispanic community is suffering every day?
First of all, I don't think we have to change the subject away. I think we have to do both, and sometimes they're interrelated. But the great denominator today, the great divider in America economically is education. If you have more than a high school education, you're in one demographic group economically. If you're a high school dropout, or you just graduated high school and nothing more, you're in a secondary group. And the reality of the 21st century is it will increasingly, if it is not already, impossible to be prosperous in the 21st century if all you have is a high school diploma. Now, the other challenge is that too many of our growing careers in America, and this is a good thing, require less than a 4-year education, but more than a high school diploma. And we've stigmatized that. So it's great that Daniela wants to be a molecular biologist, but there are kids in Miami who right now are graduating from high school certified as BMW technicians. They'll start at $45,000 a year at 18. We need to, and they're good at it, and they love doing it, and they have a passion for it, and our nation needs that too. So I know it's cliche-ish to say education is the solution. Education is empowerment. It gives you the skills not just to compete, but also to learn. Once you have these basic skills, we really need to understand that that is really what's dividing America today economically. Increasingly, the divisions in America between those who have and those who don't is the level of education and the social economic realities of where they come from. Those two things work hand in hand. So I think what you're talking about is really about empowerment. It's about how do we continue to create mechanisms for empowerment. That's why I'm a huge believer in student financial aid programs. I'll play right now, I would not have been able to go to college without Pell Grants and access to student loans. I still have a student loan, by the way. I pay some lady named Sally Mae every month for my law school degree. My parents couldn't save for my education. If those programs didn't exist, I probably could have worked my way through school, but it would have taken 8 years, or 12 instead of 7. So I believe in those programs. And now, because I was able to go to school, I'm a taxpayer who can help fund programs for other people to be able to do the same thing. So I believe in those programs. But I also believe culturally, this is not a governmental thing. Culturally, we have to encourage our kids to dream. If there's one thing my parents, and I know we're running a little long, but I want to share this with you. The rest you'll have to buy my book to get. But if there's one thing my parents deeply implanted in me and in my siblings from a very young age, is that we were expected to do better than they were because we had chances they never did. From a very young age, we were never given the option of you can decide to be a bartender if you want. We were told and expected. You are expected to do better than we did. We expect you to go to college, graduate, and have a profession because we wanted that for ourselves, but we couldn't do it. We have to have expectations for our children. They have to be very clear from a young age that we expect them to succeed, that they have everything it takes to succeed, and that's what we expect of them as well. That's more of a cultural value than it is a political one, but I think it's one that's very prevalent in the Hispanic community across America.
And with that plug for Sally Mae, Senator, we want to thank you very much. It's been a terrific session. Thank you for all of your time.